Hello, good afternoon, and Pinhanda. My role is to formally welcome you to our School of Journalism, Media and Cultural Studies, affectionately known as JOMEC, and also to make something of a sales pitch for our postgraduate division, very subtly, which is directly informed by several of the issues we will be discussing today. If you will kindly indulge me for a moment or two, though, I would like to mention that it was in thinking about these issues, and here I must say I really found the concept of data justice to be remarkably rich and productive, that I found myself looking at something I happened to be reading from a fresh perspective. Joanna Redden and I are currently co-writing an article about science journalism together, focusing on science, citizen science, which happens to be one of my interests, and big data, which is her expertise. And in my bit, tracing the emergence of citizen science, and here citizen science very loosely defined is the collection and analysis of data relating to the natural world by members of the general public, typically as part of a collaborative project with professional scientists. I dusted off an old, mildewy copy of Lancelot Hogben's weighty tome, Science for the Citizen. And it was first published in 1938. And when I say a weighty tome, it's about 1,100 pages long. And it's a book which is credited, often credited at least, with helping to inspire the general science movement, calling for scientific education to be much more inclusive in the 1930s. And Hogben, who was a British experimental zoologist and medical statistician, intended his book to be an intervention aimed at engaging the non-scientists in scientific inquiry. To quote him, natural science is an essential part of the education of a citizen because scientific discoveries affect the lives of everyone. The living history of science, he said, is coextensive with that of civilized living. And he continues, I'll just go a paragraph here. It expands as the record becomes accessible to a widening personnel, gathering into itself and coordinating the fruits of new crafts. It languishes when the social incentive to new productive accomplishments is lacking, and when its custodians lose the will to share it with others. Its history, which is the history of the constructive achievements of mankind, humankind, is also the history of the democratization of positive knowledge. End of quote. I'll let that phrase, the democratization of positive knowledge, hang in the air a moment, because I like the way it resonates for our purposes today. In this way, I would suggest science was being effectively recognized as being politicized, just as scientists were obliged to exercise their social responsibilities as citizens. Thoughtful citizens, in Hogben's words, realize that no society is safe in the hands of a few clever people. End of quote. The future of scientific inquiry, Hogben believed, was dependent on cooperation between scientists and their fellow citizens in order to align the application of scientific knowledge with common needs. Modern science, it followed, offered a new social contract, one demanding a new orientation of educational values and new qualifications for civic responsibility. So if in the earlier ages, and here Hogben reminds his reader that science, in his words, liberated us from the terror of the gods, in 1938 he wanted to extend this critique into a challenge against the capitalist system. Quote, scientific planning gives us the means of planning for plenty and also helps to free us from habits which prevent us from doing so. Now, where Britain was concerned, Hogben contended that such analyses of human needs would not be emerging from its universities. He said, where the teaching on current social problems is dominated by the dreary futilities of deductive economics. Rather, it was much more likely that men and women who, in his words, bring the live curiosity and painstaking industry of the naturalist to bear on problems of contemporary society who will be the symbol of a popular movement. And he passionately believed the makers of this new social contract would be necessarily the founders of a new social culture. Which brings us, I think, to an interesting vantage point from which to identify, evaluate, and explore the questions at stake for data justice. To what extent, we might ask, does data justice prefigure a new social contract, to use Hogben's phrase? and thereby a new orientation of educational values and new qualifications for civic responsibility. How might we contribute to the, again to use his phrase, democratization of positive knowledge? Please discuss. Back to the task at hand. Welcome everyone. Today's launch is an auspicious moment for the school. We are very proud of our colleagues' stellar efforts inventing the Data Justice Lab and setting it into motion. It dovetails so nicely with important work underway across the breadth of our school, in particular the Digital Media and Society Research Group, as well as so much of our BA and MA teaching. Regarding the latter, and here's the sales pitch I did warn you, especially our MA in News Journalism, our MA in Digital Media and Society, and in conjunction with colleagues in the School of Computer Science, our MSc in Computational and Data Journalism. Further details on our website. I'll stop here by expressing my gratitude to our distinguished speakers for joining us today, and to thank you as well for coming along to participate in the discussion. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Stuart. So I'll just say a few brief words about the sort of rationale behind the launch and the ideas behind this kind of data justice lab, but only very briefly, and then I'll hand over to Arne, who's going to talk a bit more about some of the specific things we're thinking with doing with this lab, what we'd like to do at least. But we're talking about sort of, I suppose our concern is with datafication, which is about sort of certain developments that are happening with our digital technologies that means that more and more social activity and human behavior is being turned into data points, so quantified in a way that can be enumerated and calculated, and that can be collected and tracked, whether that be our friendships, our eating habits, our financial transactions, our work productivity, our movements and emotions. So our interactions on digital platforms, search histories, shopping activities, etc., all generate data, as do even our faces as we walk through the streets or the place where we stop for coffee. So the advancement of this datafication has been premised on this notion that by being able to collect and calculate more and more social activity and human behavior, we will also be able to understand it better and predict what will happen in the future. So the idea is that by being able to predict things in the future, we will also have better responses. So we're coming to this area of this question of datafication and to think about this idea that supposedly we will have better responses if we can predict the future based on datafication. Because we have done previous research, all three of us, relating to governance and to surveillance, and we did a project looking at the Snowden leaks, where a lot of these ideas also came from of shifting the debate towards this notion of data justice. Because the Snowden leaks taught us something very significant about the nature and extent of datafication and the ways in which contemporary modes of governance rely on a particular political economy of digital developments that advance a logic of prediction and modification of human behavior as a means to produce revenue that is rooted in everyday technologies of so-called ordinary citizens. And it is within these infrastructures that data is generated, collected, analyzed, and used. And that means that as citizens living in an increasingly digital environment, we at once enact agency via digital infrastructures, but that also simultaneously datafy that agency as part of a social structure. So we are, as digital citizens, not just active, but also monitored, profiled, categorized, and scored. And we are increasingly so with the current landscape where, for example, in the UK, with the Investigatory Powers Act and the upcoming Digital Economy Act, well, soon to be passed Digital Economy Act, we have a political context that also enables data collection and data sharing. And this raises important questions about what this means for society, for citizenship, and for social justice, which is what we're talking about today. And a lot of focus has been on questions around privacy and the protection of personal data. And a lot of the response has been advanced around an idea of technological solutions and regulation pertaining to protecting personal data. And now this is being increasingly incorporated into a general focus on data ethics and different rights frameworks to some extent. But I think we want to ask, and some of the questions that we've had when we did our research, is that whether this is an adequate response. Because datafication advances and is part of much broader issues, I feel. So perhaps we feel that there's a lack of real engagement with the full implications of what something like the Snowden leaks actually revealed, and this broader trend of datafying our social life. So that data is actually being used to build a new infrastructure, a new form of decision-making that is being advanced on the premise of providing more efficient and so-called objective solutions to social problems. So it's about saving resources, and importantly, we have to remember that this is replacing other kinds of information and other ways of making decisions that might have been there before. And it's based on this idea that we can categorize and determine risk, and that it can be used across social life. And this is happening in employment, in border control, crime and criminal justice, in education, in health, and in welfare. So this introduces some issues that I think perhaps have been missed in some of the data debates, particularly in the post-Snowden context, partly perhaps because of this focus on individual privacy and on this techno-legal solutionism, and the kinds of containments we've had around the debates that I think we need to continue to question. And I think we are seeing increasingly a shift in concerns around datafication, a concern from privacy to more explicit engagement perhaps with questions of power, questions that highlight things around the fact that data processes are uneven, that perhaps we have to think about things like social sorting, that data processes discriminate and exclude at all different stages, that data processes create new stratifications of have and have-nots between those who are able to profile and those who are subjected to that profiling, but also broader issues around categorization and due process, transparency, and also ownership of data. And also that data processes advance a new politics that is based on prediction and preemption, and that we are, as citizens, increasingly understood in terms of our data double and our data scores and on decontextualized data. So these issues push questions of social justice to the forefront and highlight the need for a systemic critique of digital infrastructures, the need to understand these in the context of existing and new political agendas, economic structures, and social visions, the need for interdisciplinary dialogue, and linked to that, the need for broadening the range of stakeholders that are involved in the debate on data. So when we think about social justice in the age of datafication, we're thinking not just about individual privacy, but also about how datafication impacts on particular communities, whose interests are being advanced, who is being disenfranchised, how not only digital but social and economic rights are implicated, labor rights, gender and sexual rights, migrants' rights, the protection of vulnerable communities like refugees, and what kind of politics and modes of governance are being created, and what kind of data citizen is being rewarded, and what kind of data citizen is being punished. And we're thinking about what kind of alternative imaginations and deals on data are possible today that situate social justice at its core and that advances a different politics, economy, and social vision. So basically, by launching this Data Justice Lab, we want to create a space within the UK and perhaps Europe more broadly, where we think these types of considerations are perhaps still in their infancy, so to advance research and practice that engages with data and datafication from this perspective. And also importantly, bring communities together across technology and social justice and across disciplines. So we hope the discussion today will take us further down this agenda. But I'll hand over now to Arne, who's going to tell us some of the ways in which we think the Data Justice Lab might play a role in this.
Well, just a few additional words, perhaps. I mean, just to add a little bit on what was said, but nothing substantially new. So what we're interested in is really both understanding and intervening into these processes with what we're trying to do here and what we're kind of planning to do. And so this is a research lab. We're at the university, and so of course our main focus, first of all, is research. We want to understand what social justice means in terms of datafication, what the interests are behind datafication, what the consequences are for all of us, and so on. We're interested in questions of social inclusion and exclusion through data collection, and the challenges that were raised of surveillance and monitoring, and so on. The practice of database profiling and categorizing of populations, and how this is becoming a model of governance and control, and perhaps then also what this means for transformation in the relation between, the power relations between the state and citizens. And so we're planning to develop research projects in that area. At the moment we're discussing projects, for example, around data governance, how data is governed, but also how data is becoming a new model of governance, a means of governance. Or in the area of citizen data scores, basically the governance of people by assigning data scores to individuals, which is an credit scores and so on. It's an increasing practice and it's expanding. And the impact of datafication on particular communities and the implications of that for how we understand rights and, of course, social justice. And so we want to, we're at the moment developing research projects around some of these areas. We're also, of course, planning to have more events like this one here, where we bring different people together around these issues. So that's kind of the research, the academic area, but in addition to that, we're also very interested in practical development of data justice tools and policies and infrastructures, but in a way that responds to our understanding of data justice. So it's not about outsourcing tech development to tech developers, and it's not about making each of us responsible for the tools that we use and so on, but bringing together those concerned with social justice in various areas, and human rights and anti-discrimination, in housing and health and so on, with digital rights campaigners and with tech developers. And that may include workshops on collaborative tech design, that may include policy hackathons, data trainings for civil society organizations and journalists, engagement with processes, with development processes, for example, smart city development, to advance responsible use of data in these, and engagement with the development and implementation of digital democracy platforms, for example, to again raise awareness and of data use and implement a different or develop a different way of implementing data use there. And so now that's a wide range of areas, there are lots of ideas and plans, but we'll of course have to see how much we can do. But for all of this, it would be really great to work with many of you, many of those who are here now, many others also who work in our field, and to make this, or some of it, possible. And at the moment, the Data Justice Lab is really the three of us mainly, and we're starting to think about, or to create some plans for that. But we hope this can become a place of engagement and exchange, and for making data justice happen. And yeah, if you want to work with us on this, please get in touch, and let's do this. Thank you very much. And then, so.
I just need to put the stick.
Okay. So, Joanna Redden will now introduce our main speaker. So we got all the introductory circles out of the way and come to the actual substance of the day.
Thank you. It's my great pleasure to be able to introduce our speakers tonight. We feel very fortunate that they have traveled so far to talk with us, and so we can listen to them, and also have made time for our speaker who is going to be interacting with us digitally to speak to us tonight. So I'll begin by introducing Virginia Eubanks. She is the author of Digital Dead End, Fighting for Social Justice in the Information Age, and co-editor of Ain't Gonna Let Nobody Turn Me Around, 40 Years of Movement Building with Barbara Smith. She's also the co-founder of Our Knowledge, Our Power, a grassroots economic justice and welfare rights organization. Professor Eubanks is currently working on her third book, Digital Poorhouse, for St. Martin's Press. In it, she examines how new data-driven systems regulate and discipline the poor in the United States. She is a fellow at New America, a Washington, D.C. think tank, and the recipient of a 3-year research grant from the Digital Trust Foundation to explore the meaning of digital privacy and data justice in marginalized communities. And it's my great pleasure to welcome Virginia to speak to us tonight. Thanks, Virginia.
First thing I want to do is say that the name of the book has changed. So you'll be introduced to the book. I'm in the middle of fighting with my editor, literally this minute, about what the book's going to be called. So I'm going to tell you a different title while I'm talking, and then it's going to come out under a totally different title in about a year. So that's one thing I want to say. And the second thing I want to say is the project that Joanna mentioned is a collaborative project, the Digital Trust Foundation project, with Sita Pena-Gagarin, who's here, and then 3 amazing community researchers, Tamika Lewis in Charlotte, North Carolina, Tawana Petty in Detroit, Michigan, and Mariela Saba in Los Angeles. So I just wanted to, that's not all me, it's a wonderful team of folks. But I am Virginia Eubanks, and I'm really excited to be here. And I want to get sort of a temperature check in the room, right? It's a foggy, kind of rainy day, it's a little bit of a beige room. A bunch of people who are here have been sitting in a small meeting room all day long already. So I want people to give me like happy twinkle fingers if their energy is pretty good and they're ready to go. Down, bad, evil twinkle fingers. Yeah, see, there's some evil twinkle fingers. Good. No, that's what this, it's information, it's data, right? And this is an ongoing thing. So happy fingers if I'm saying something you want me to say more about. Sad twinkle fingers if you're getting bored and you want me to move on, because there's some fantastic folks who are going to speak up for me. So it's a minimum interaction, but it's slightly interactive. I also really want to thank Lena, Arn, Joanna, and Sarah for all of their hard work getting me here and this opportunity to engage in what I think is a really important conversation. And also to really celebrate the Data Justice Lab, which I'm super excited to see what happens, and I hope that this is the beginning of a long relationship, and not just my first time ever to Wales. And I also want to thank everyone in the room who was at the earlier meeting today, really to thank you for your energy and your enthusiasm and the incredible smarts that everybody is bringing to this ongoing discussion. And like I said, hopefully this is just the beginning of a longer conversation that we'll continue to have, because sort of the stakes of things that we're talking about as datafication or the opacity of algorithms or the limits of privacy, the stakes are actually really high. They're really material and really immediate for a lot of folks. But the way we talk about these things often gets really abstract really fast. They're often complicated technical systems. They're often things that are what people will call black boxed, meaning that they're built inside sort of a dark area and you never get to see in it. So it makes perfect sense that these things would get abstract quickly. But each of these things really does have immediate material consequence for millions of people. And over the last 3 years, I've been traveling all over the United States, talking primarily to poor and working class people about how new database tools in human and social services are affecting their lives, are impacting their day-to-day lives. So what I'd like to do to sort of ground this conversation in the concrete and to start in the lives of those folks is to start with some of the human stories behind the big picture of the rise of what I call the new regime of data. So I'm going to start with the story of Omega Young. In the fall of 2008, Omega Young of Evansville, Indiana, missed an appointment to recertify for Medicaid because she was in the hospital suffering from terminal cancer. The cancer that began in her ovaries spread to her kidneys, breast, and liver. Her chemotherapy left her weak and emaciated. And Young, a mother of 2 grown sons, was really struggling to meet the requirements of a new automated eligibility system for welfare, Medicaid, and food stamps. So she called her county help center to let them know that she was hospitalized, so she couldn't make an appointment to recertify for Medicaid, and her medical benefits and food stamps were cut off. The reason was a sort of catch-all phrase that they were using called failure to cooperate with establishing eligibility for Medicaid. And the eligibility modernization system that was happening in Indiana was launched in 2006, was led by a team of high-tech companies, including IBM and ACS. And the system actually interpreted any mistake that was made in applying for social programs, applications that are often anywhere from 10 to 35 pages long. Any one mistake was interpreted by the system as affirmative refusal to comply with the rules of the agency. And thus gave the agency reason to sanction or deny people for failure to cooperate, like Omega Young. Because she lost her benefits, Young was unable to afford her medications. She lost her food stamps. She struggled to pay her rent. She lost access to free transportation for medical appointments. And Omega Young died on March 1st, 2009. The next day, on March 2nd, she won an appeal for wrongful termination and all of her benefits were restored. Okay, so that's story one. Story two is Uncle Gary Boatwright. So when I met Uncle Gary in May 2016, he was living in a gray and green tent on East 6th Street on the edge of Skid Row in downtown Los Angeles. He's a straight-talking, very funny man, and he has sort of thinning white hair and these like Santa Claus blue twinkly eyes. He's had a dozen careers: welder, mason, paralegal, door-to-door salesman, law student, and most recently he was a document processor for a wholesale mortgage lender, one that actually was named one of the top subprime companies that most responsible for cratering the United States economy. So we met to talk about the system called coordinated entry, which attempts to match unhoused people in Los Angeles County with appropriate available housing interventions. They call it the Match.com of homeless services. The process includes a comprehensive survey that's called, as all these things have crazy acronyms, it's called the VI-SPDAT, which stands for the Vulnerability Index Service Decision Assistance Tool. I'll just call it the VI-SPDAT. Interaction, thank you. Okay, so the VI-SPDAT includes some really invasive, comprehensive questions that specifically focus on risky behavior. And I'll just give you one. And think maybe to yourself about how you feel about answering this question. Do you ever do things that may be considered to be risky? Like exchange sex for money, run drugs for someone, have unprotected sex with someone you don't know, share a needle, or anything like that. So the survey responses to the VI-SPDAT are entered into an electronic registry of the homeless, and a ranking algorithm gives each person what's called a vulnerability score, which is then used to create a prioritized list of homeless people who might qualify for a shrinking number of spots in permanent supportive housing. Just to contextualize, there's 44,000 homeless people in Los Angeles, which is the size of the city that I live in, right? So my entire city is homeless in Los Angeles. And one of the things that's unique about Los Angeles, like New York City has 52,000 homeless people, but most of them are in some kind of shelter. Often it's not safe shelter, and it's certainly not, it certainly can be an assault on human dignity, but it's some kind of shelter. In Los Angeles, approximately 80% of the people who are homeless are completely unhoused, meaning they're living in a tent on the sidewalk, or they're living in a car, or under a bridge. So Gary's taken the VI-SPDAT 3 times. Each person he's taken it with has told him that they can do better with the survey than the last person he took it with. But he still doesn't think he scored very high. So he's 64, but he's healthy, besides a little high blood pressure and some loss of hearing. His substance abuse isn't abusive or debilitating. He found out that he has a mental health record in Orange County, but he doesn't know what's in it because no one ever told him. It just came up when he was in court once, so no one's ever shared his diagnosis with him. So he feels like his score on a scale of 0 to 17 is probably not very high. It's probably like an 8. So the problem, he sees it, is not his comparative vulnerability to other homeless folks. It's simple math. There's not enough housing in Los Angeles to house the 44,000 homeless people. And so he said to me, people like me who are somewhat higher functioning, we're just not getting housing. It's another way of kicking the can down the road. In order to house the homeless, you have to have available units. Show me the units, otherwise you're lying. So this November, Gary was arrested. He was charged with breaking the window of a public bus with a 99-cent store broom, which he argues is actually physically impossible. Like those plastic, really sort of sad brooms. When he gets out, he will have lost everything. His tent, his paperwork, his relationship with local organizations and friends, and he will score lower on the VI-SPDAT because for the period of time that he was incarcerated, it's counted as being housed. So the model will actually see him as less vulnerable, and his priority score will slip even lower. So that's Uncle Gary Boatwright. Last story is Angel Shepherd and Patrick Green. So I met Angel Shepard and Patrick Grieve at the Duquesne Family Support Center, which is a community hub that serves in struggling families, all families, but it mostly works with low-income families, in the impoverished suburbs that ring Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, also the home of the Uber self-driving car. And the couple didn't really stand out to me right away. As a journalist, right, you're always looking for like the sexiest story and like the worst case scenario. And so they totally didn't stand out because their experience is so utterly average. It's so completely characteristic of the routine, mundane indignities of being poor in America. So they struggled with low-wage, dangerous work, poor quality schools, and predatory private online colleges, poor health, community violence. And also, between the two of them, they've racked up more than half a dozen interactions with an agency that many poor families come into contact with, but many middle-class people never really know exists, which is the Allegheny County Office of Children, Youth, and Families, CYF. Sometimes people call it in the US CPS, Child Protective Services. So Patrick was investigated for medical neglect in the early 2000s when he was unable to afford his daughter Tabitha's antibiotic prescription after an emergency room visit. When Angel's daughter Harriet was 5, an anonymous tipster phoned in a string of reports to the Child Abuse and Neglect Hotline and suggested that she was unsupervised, that she was down the block teasing a dog, that she wasn't properly clothed, fed, or bathed, and that she wasn't receiving needed medication. For each call, an investigator came to the house, interviewed Harriet and Tabitha, Angel and Patrick, the neighbors, the school teachers, looked in all the cupboards, looked under all the beds, and requested access to the family's medical records. Often these visits come at night, by the way, so they can, see what really happens at the home. But it's actually, of course, incredibly disruptive for families who, like, kids are sleeping and have to be pulled out of bed and stuff. In each case, they found no evidence of maltreatment and closed the case. Each of these interactions, though, was entered into the family's case file, which is held in an integrated data warehouse that was developed by the agency in 1999. And since August 2016, anytime a hotline call is received on potential child maltreatment, a statistical risk model is run to try and predict which children are at greatest risk for abuse and neglect. And among the variables that are most crucial to the algorithm are things like past interactions with the CYF system, like Angel and Patrick have, and also the use of supportive services for poor families, food stamps, county medical services, cash assistance, mental health records, stuff like that. So Patrick and Angel basically live in terror that there'll be another call on their family and that the algorithm will target their daughter and their granddaughter for investigation and possibly for removal to foster care. And it is a not irrational fear because one of the things that the algorithm really tests for is intensive use of county services. And Patrick and Angel have come in contact with a lot of county services, but they've also sought them out. They've sought them out explicitly to be better parents. They've become part of community organizations that serve other poor parents. And they're very involved with the system. So Angel said to me, you feel like a prisoner. You feel trapped. It's like no matter what you do, it isn't good enough for them. My daughter's now 9, and I'm still afraid they're going to come up one day and see her out by herself in the yard, pick her up, and say, you can't have her anymore. Okay, so these are my 3 stories. The automation of welfare eligibility in Indiana, the electronic registry of the homeless in Los Angeles, and the child maltreatment prediction model in Allegheny County in Pennsylvania that form the heart of my new book, which is called Today, Digital Denial, How High-Tech Tools Hide Inequality, Undercut Democracy, and Punish the Poor. And I want to offer them a way of sort of grounding this fascinating conversation we're having today in the specific lived reality of people's lives, and particularly in the lives of people who are facing the most dangerous and invasive impacts of the new regime of data. And I also offer them because if you start from the point of view of Omega Young or Gary Boatwright or Angel and Patrick, it really upends many of the assumptions we take for granted when we talk about data, algorithms, privacy, and transparency. Is anyone checking how much time I have left?
Yep.
Do I have 5 minutes still?
7.
Oh, this is great. Okay, so in celebration of the Data Justice Lab today, I want to offer some kind of provocations that arise from these stories. And I offer them really in the hope and in the faith that it'll spur us to our sort of deepest, most critical thinking, and really help communicate the sense of urgency, like why we should care about these things that often feel very abstract. And I hope that'll set up Malavika and Steven to discuss some of the great campaign work they're doing out in the world in a minute. So just 3 provocations. The first is that this idea that the new regime of data inevitably disrupts old forms of power and privilege, right? The sort of cheerleaders or the prophets of datafication love to say this, right? Big data disrupts business practices. Algorithms disrupt bureaucracies. But as often as the regime of data dismantles old power relationships, it reaffirms older and often more punitive power relationships and forms of government. So in the book, actually, I argue that the new regime of data, at least in the human and social services in the US, is absolutely in line with the punitive poverty policies of our past. Everything from the county poorhouse from the 1820s, here you might also call them almshouses or workhouses, I'll just put it all under poorhouse. So from county poorhouses to scientific casework. Like older practices, the objects of these systems is to contain the poor, to investigate and police them, and I think most importantly, to create complicated moral classifications that allow policymakers and frontline caseworkers to make what are at heart inhuman decisions, impossible decisions. Which families have food and which starve, who is sheltered and who lives on the street, and which families are pulled apart by the state. So the provocation I want to offer here is, how do we know which political and value systems will be disrupted and which will be affirmed, right, when we talk about these new data practices? And then more importantly, how do we push these systems towards disrupting oppressive institutions and reaffirming values that support abundance, justice, and democracy? So that's the first provocation. The second provocation is the idea that the new regime of data impacts everyone in the same way. So the whole point of datafication, or the new regime of data, is actually to slice the world into finer and finer classifications. So it's really sort of asked backwards to respond to that increasing sophistication of classification with sort of blanket one-size-fits-all solutions. Like, we need more transparency, or we need clearer privacy language, or we need to audit algorithms. Because an algorithm that finds you sort of the perfect pair of peak-toe pumps on Zappos is like a very, very different beast from the algorithm that identifies problem gamblers so that casinos can target market to them and most efficiently drain them of all their resources. Those are just completely different things, and we need to deal with them as different things. So the provocation here is, how do we recognize the fact that data doesn't land on smooth ground? How do we center the experiences of those folks who see themselves as the targets, not the beneficiaries of these systems, especially the poor, communities of color, unpopular religious groups, migrants, sexual minorities, and other folks? And my final provocation is the idea that more data or information inevitably leads to better policy. So there are a lot of people who are incredibly smart about data, information, and complex systems. But we're often naive, even remarkably naive, about politics. Part of the reason, I think, is that those of us who sort of seek to harness computational power for social justice tend to have a kind of an affinity for systems engineering approaches to problems. And system engineering basically assumes that you can manage complex systems by getting correct information where it needs to go as quickly and efficiently as possible. But that assumption relies on the idea that political conflicts only emerge from ignorance, right? You just don't know any better. And if we just had all the facts, the correct answers to intractable policy problems like homelessness or child maltreatment will be simple, clear, and of course shared by everyone, because they will be apolitical, because the facts will be apolitical. This just isn't true, and this isn't the way that politics works at all. Our political conflicts are more than informational, right? They're about values, they're about how we identify with groups and identifying group membership, and they're frankly about legitimately conflicting interests, right? So in LA, there's legitimately conflicting interests between the unhoused folks who are looking for, to attain their basic human right to housing, the downtown businesses who want like a clean, safe, walkable, fun downtown LA, the police, who are looking to contain and investigate what they see as a criminal population, though most of those crimes are status crimes and not very dangerous to anyone but the people engaged in them. And to the government of the city and the taxpayers who don't want to see homeless people but don't want to pay for housing, right? Having the right number for the number of homeless people and how vulnerable they are compared to each other is not going to solve that problem. That is an intractable political problem. So the provocation here is, how do we put data in its proper place in our social justice work? Because of course we want more better data, but we can't assume that the right information will somehow magically bend the moral arc of the universe towards justice. And that's why I'm really excited to be here today and to talk about what work this organization, this group, and these folks can do. And thank you so much for your time and attention, and twinkle fingers.
Thanks so much, Virginia. We'll have time, about 30 minutes at the end, for questions and comments, and I look forward to that. I'll introduce our next speaker, who has been patiently waiting online.
Hi, Steven.
Hi, Steven.
So just go ahead and dive in.
Okay, no, I'm going to introduce you first, Steven, but I just want to make sure it was going to work before I launched into it. Okay, so Steven Renderos is organizing director at the Center for Media Justice. He's got over 10 years of organizing experience and been involved in campaigns to lower the cost of prison phone calls, preserving the open internet, and expanding community-owned radio stations. Steven previously served as project coordinator of the Minnesotano Media Empowerment Project, an initiative focused on improving the quality and quantity of media coverage and representation of Latinos in Minnesota. He currently serves on the boards of Organizing Apprenticeship Project and La Asamblea de Derechos Civiles. Steven also is a DJ. He hosts a radio show called Radio Poco at a community radio station and spins at venues in New York City. So please join me in welcoming Steven.
Out of there. I've since moved to Los Angeles, so I need to update my bio. Is it possible to get the audio muted from over there? Perfect. Awesome. Otherwise, I'm going to be hearing myself, and that's not going to work. So thank you so much for the opportunity to come and speak with you all. Congratulations to the Data Justice Lab for opening. It's such a critical component of this broader conversation that we're having around data and social justice. Research is such an important part of what's needed. And I say that as someone who has been working on these issues for a few years now, and it's always surprising to me just the amount of information that we don't know, particularly because there isn't the data and research to back it up. So the work of all of you all in that room and some of my esteemed panelists here are so critical to the work that I do as a community organizer. So I won't be able to do the twinkle fingers with you all today. That would have been awesome, so that I know what to focus on. But I think what I'll do is I'll introduce CMJ and the work that we do, and to provide you a bit of our kind of framework for how we look at the work that we do, define this term media justice. And then I thought I could go into just looking at the issues that we're particularly concerned with when we think about social justice in the digital age, and provide you a few specific examples of places where we've done some active work in that space. And just as a preview, I'll largely be focusing on surveillance. So the three kind of technologies that I want to speak to are body-worn cameras, the use of cell phone interceptors, otherwise known as stingrays, and social media surveillance. And lastly, I'll just close out with kind of some of our thoughts about what the path forward looks in terms of our work, like what are the principles that are guiding the work that we do. So cool, so 20 minutes, 10-10, I've got myself timed, second. So Center for Media Justice is a national racial justice organizing hub based in Oakland, California. And what we do is we champion the media and technology rights of communities of color and of poor people here in the United States. The primary work we do is building grassroots leadership, and we do that through a network that we call the Media Action Grassroots Network, or MAGNET for short. Currently, our network has about 100 racial justice organizations based in every region in the United States. Kind of a core principle of what we do is that we believe that the right to communicate belongs to everyone. And we believe that therefore the right to transform our society does too. Media justice was born out of a reality as a response to a media system that was largely not reflective of our society. By the time CMJ was founded in 2008, the media system here in the United States was already massively consolidated. In other words, there were a handful of companies that owned the majority of the media that we consumed. At that time, and today, this is also true, that amounts to about 5 to 6 companies, large media conglomerates, and I'm certain these dynamics are also very, very much the same in other parts of the world. But if you compare that here in the United States to back in the 1980s, there were roughly about 50 companies that owned a lot of the media that we consume. So since in that time, there's been this massive level of consolidation. And to speak to why that's harmful or why that's bad, I'll pull up a quote from Malcolm X, who said that the media is the most powerful entity on earth. They have the power to make the innocent look guilty and to make the guilty look innocent, and that's power, because they control the minds of the masses. Now, when we think about this reality of our media system, we looked at it and knew that it wasn't just simply the result of lucrative financial transactions. That was certainly a big part of it. But undergirding those conditions were policies that were placed to allow for this level of consolidation to happen. What's been true about advocating for media policy here in the United States is that largely has been consolidated in a handful of communities, lawyers, public interest groups, but many of those that don't look anything like the communities that our network represents. When media justice as a framework emerged, it really came out of media activists, mostly from communities of color, who were frustrated that the kind of resistance to changing our media system was largely white, and it was progressive but largely white, and therefore not really accounting for the needs of our communities. So that's where this media justice kind of framework emerged, and for us we define it simply as media justice is the transformation of media, both visual and structural, for the purpose of social change. So we see media as a fundamental vehicle for shaping the hearts and minds of people in the United States for the purpose of pushing forward ideas, solutions, and stories grounded in social justice. So we believe that in order to change racism and poverty, we have to transform our media system. And in the digital age today, increasingly that means fighting for our digital rights. Over the years, some of the work that we've done has largely focused on the media representation, rights to the internet, more affordable access to different vehicles of communication. Those have been kind of the issues that we've tended to fight on. We knew that when we fight against media, when we fight for media representation, like fighting for more radio stations owned by community groups, we know that we're shaping and fighting back against hateful stereotypes. When we opposed media consolidation, we knew that we were also standing up for the rights of workers whose jobs were being eliminated by these corporate mergers, and for families who were having to pay more just to stay connected. So we tended to find issues within our network to fight for where there was a clear intersection across media and social justice and racial justice. Lately, a lot of that work has really driven us towards surveillance. Like many people, I think we came to this issue in kind of the post-Edward Snowden revelations world. I think the slight difference or the slight caveat I would put out there is that the revelations of Edward Snowden popularized the idea that surveillance was happening here in the United States and abroad in massive scales. What we understood to be true is, just grounded in our history of the United States, is that surveillance isn't random. surveillance does have a very distinct purpose. And in the United States, that checkered history tends to be directed towards voices of opposition and specific communities, so communities of color, activists, immigrants, etc., who are trying to hold government or police accountable. So in that way, I think the way that we look at this work around surveillance is, to quote one of our members, the Stop LAPD Spying Coalition, who I know Virginia's done some work with here in LA. Surveillance is not about a moment in time, it's a continuation of history. So the way we think about surveillance in the context of today around the use of technology for surveillance, we understand that it's grounded in a much longer history, dating back to Pointel Probe, and even before that, Red Squads here in the United States. That there is a longer history here of how the state has used surveillance for a specific purpose to target specific communities. Right now, I think the way that we are looking at the issue of surveillance has been to understand how law enforcement agencies are adopting these technologies and providing them a mechanism to surveil people that they are in effect sworn to protect. But it's, I think, important to understand the context for where these technologies are being adopted. What are the local conditions that are true on the ground where these technologies exist? It's no secret that in the United States, there is a problem of racist policing on the part of many police departments in the US, and particularly how it affects communities of color, and in particular Black communities. I can only speak to my own example here. I'll share a quick story just to give you a sense of the kind of my interaction with this, with this particular topic. When I first got my driver's license, I think I was in Los Angeles, where I grew up. You have to drive. This is a driving city. So the day that I could get a driver's license, you can officially get a driver's license here at 15 and a half. I was at the local Department of Motor Vehicles applying for a driver's license. Shortly after that, I got a car. The second day I had my driver's license and my car, I was pulled over by Los Angeles Police Department for driving in a good neighborhood. And in fact, that's what they told me. This is a nice neighborhood, this is a nice car, what are you doing, driving in this neighborhood? A few weeks after that, I got pulled over for driving in what they called the wrong neighborhood. It so happened to be a few blocks away from my home, so take that as you will. But that's been kind of my experience with police departments here in the United States, and in particular in Los Angeles. And for many communities of color, that's been that kind of frequent interaction with police departments in a context that doesn't really make sense is lived reality. We see the consequences of that increased interaction with police when you look at our system of incarceration here in the United States. We have over 2 million people in the United States who are incarcerated. We have millions more that routinely go in and out of jail, cycle in and out. People who are arrested for various different reasons. Some of the stuff that I think Virginia pointed at, particularly as it relates to homeless folks, you see, that there are folks that are being kind of rounded up and having increased contact with police departments, and in the U.S. context, that means communities of color. So now we are given that context. Now technology is being applied to the function of policing. So here's where I'll dive into some specific examples to talk about how this is playing out. And I'll specifically also speak to the reasons why they're being adopted. So let's start with body-worn cameras. As many folks are probably familiar with, in the aftermath of the murder of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, there was a massive outcry from communities here in the United States, that particularly those involved in the movement for Black Lives and hashtag Black Lives Matter, calling for an end to police violence. So in that kind of aftermath of that murder in Ferguson, we also saw the death of Eric Garner in New York. We saw the murder of Freddie Gray in Baltimore, Maryland, which gave rise to further uprisings and protests. there was this kind of air of a need. This is back in 2015. There was a real air for a need to do something. And the solution that was promulgated at the very top from the White House during the Obama administration and the Department of Justice is, well, we need to increase more accountability by local police departments. And the way we can do that is by the introduction of body-worn cameras, having police officers actually wear cameras in their persons. And so what they did is they made millions of dollars available for local police departments to adopt this. The reality is, however, that body-worn cameras were a thing that were being adopted by local police departments before 2015. Going back as early as 2012, you can find examples of where police departments were running pilot programs and adopting body-worn cameras for local policing. And it wasn't really being done in a way to increase police accountability. They were just being adopted because it's another investigative tool in our arsenal. When this first happened, we worked in partnership with the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights and other civil rights organizations to promote some principles for body-worn cameras. As an institution, we are opposed to the use of these body-worn cameras by local police departments, but we also recognize that it's a reality that's happening across the country. So there need to be some rules in place where those technologies exist. Shortly after promoting some principles on body-worn cameras, we also participated in a report card that looked at how these devices were being used across the country. That report was updated last year in August, and you can check it out. It's called Body-Worn Camera Scorecard.org or bwcscorecard.org. And it looks at 50 police departments across the country. At this point, most of the major cities in the United States have access to have some sort of a body-worn camera program in place. Many of those places don't have a written policy that you can access. So us as the public, thinking about police accountability, don't actually know what are the rules that are guiding police officers in the use of these devices. In many of those places, the evidentiary value of footage that's captured through a camera, meaning a police shooting or an incident that involves a police officer, maybe overstepping, the line. Much of that footage, in many places, is not even available to the public. In other cases, police officers have access to the actual footage before they even have to write a report, meaning that they can look at the footage and find ways to frame and justify what's happening in the footage when they're writing their official report. So you see this kind of example of, in the wave of police accountability, the solution that's being promoted is a technological one. And the intent, and I would say the intent from folks at the very top, at the White House and the Department of Justice, I'm sure were noble, it was a noble intent, but in practice, you see the disbursement of a technology that is facing the communities, not actually facing the police officer. And there have been examples recently of where you see police officers arrest somebody in a fairly brutal way, really beat the person up, and in the video narrate what is happening to justify what's happening. So they'll say stop resisting arrest, or I think he's got a gun or something to justify what the body-worn camera footage will show. There was one example in Florida where the gentleman literally raised his hands, started getting down on the floor in an empty parking lot because he was being chased by police. And several police officers jumped him, forced him, beat him up pretty badly. And in the footage, they're talking about how he's resisting arrest. There was an independent kind of camera in this parking lot that was kind of looking down at the scene, and you see clearly that he had his hands up. He wasn't resisting. He was just getting on the ground. So you see examples of where this is being utilized as a tool no longer for accountability, but just to justify police action. And more consequently, one of the main manufacturers of these devices, this company called Taser, is also now increasingly finding functionality to interface body-worn cameras with face recognition technology, meaning that police officers out and about can immediately run face recognition searches in real time of the people that they are coming in contact with. So in many cases, this could be someone randomly just walking down the street, but a face recognition search may be run on them, and there may be an outstanding warrant or a reason why they may need to be stopped. So now you see this functionality, this increased kind of functionality that again pushes us further and further away from police accountability and more into the realm of this just being an extra surveillance tool for the purpose of policing. So that's one example. The other I wanted to speak to was the use of stingrays or cell phone interceptors. They're also known as IMSI catchers, and I'm sure there's plenty of other fancy names we can come up for them. But essentially what these devices are is that they mimic cell phone towers, and they're about the size of a briefcase in most cases, and they can be deployed out in a given neighborhood. And immediately what it'll do is it'll start pulling, it'll start duping any cell phone within range to start communicating with it. So in that way, it can capture data. It can capture call logs, text messages, GPS location data. There's some that can do even more, actually intercept actual phone calls that are happening in place. So this very powerful device captures data in a very indiscriminate way, almost in a dragnet way. So if you happen to be in a neighborhood where a stingray device is being deployed, your phone and the data within your phone could be readily accessed by local police departments in that place. Now they exist in, I think 71 local police departments have access to this kind of a device. The Department of Justice has bought and has access to over 300 of these devices that they use across their different federal agencies, including the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and the Department of Homeland Security has access to over 100 of these devices that they use for their immigration enforcement tactics, and they've also provided grants to local police departments. So the Department of Homeland Security provided $1.8 million for local police departments that adopt these specific technologies. The Federal Bureau of Investigation, the FBI, has done the same thing. And where they've done it, they've also required local police departments to sign non-disclosure agreements, meaning that locally, those communities don't actually know that their police department has access, or not even given an opportunity to speak out on why they wouldn't want their local police department to have access to this very powerful device. We looked at how this device was being used in one particular community in Baltimore, Maryland. And we did some research to just understand how this device is being used there. And we picked Baltimore because Baltimore is one of these cities that, like many big cities in the United States, has a reputation of fairly messed up racist policing. And what we found in terms of this device, based on records requests, public FOIA requests, is that in that city, since 2007, this is when they bought this Stingray device, they used it 4,300 times. So to give you a breakdown of what that looks like, that's about more than once a day for several years. And this very powerful device in this city, they were operating it and didn't even have to get a warrant, meaning that they didn't need to go to a federal judge, or any judge for that matter, and say, you know what, we're trying to use this cell phone interceptor, and here are the reasons we're trying to use it, here's what we're trying to target. They didn't need to make a case to anybody, so essentially they could just deploy this device out in the community without any real oversight. There wasn't a working policy for this device either, so there weren't any rules to the road. So what do you do with the data that you capture? No rules to the road, so they can keep it indefinitely, essentially. So you must imagine that for a device that is as powerful as this, they must be tackling some really hardcore crime. If any of you folks have ever seen the show The Wire, which takes place in Baltimore, this show would have been over essentially in one episode with this device. But how it's being used in Baltimore is not really to tackle D'Angelo Barksdale or something like that, or Stringer Bell. One of the examples that we put in a complaint that we put together to the Federal Communications Commission is that they used this device to capture someone who had stolen chicken wings from a pizza place. So, petty theft, essentially. In other cases, it was being used to track down someone who was harassing someone via text messages. No actual, hardcore crime being committed, but yet this very powerful device that costs anywhere from $30,000 to $100,000 is being used, for this purpose. Around the same time, so what we did is we captured this data, we put it into a complaint, and we filed it with the Federal Communications Commission, making the argument that this device that functions on what we call a licensed spectrum. So, your cell phones operate on spectrum with your, local wireless provider, whoever that may be. That provider has, paid for a license to operate, wirelessly. This device doesn't do that. There's no license that's being granted to it to operate in these places, and it's duping cell phones to communicate with it. And we make the argument that it could also affect, disrupt phone calls that you're making to your family. It could disrupt emergency phone calls that are being made to 911. So we filed a complaint with the Federal Communications Commission here in the United States, making the argument that the way these stingray devices are being used by police departments, and specifically in Baltimore, were unlawful. It's an unlawful use of this device. It violates spectrum law. So we filed that complaint, and consequently around the same time that we did, the Department of Justice released a report on Baltimore, and it detailed a pattern of racist policing, of how Baltimore police departments just stop Black people more. They have higher arrest rates in those communities. And in our complaint, we actually did a demographic map of where the Black community lives in Baltimore, and overlaid that with the places where stingray devices had been used, and you see a very clear overlap. So again, we see with this device in particular, it only increases contact with police departments, increases arrest rates, increases unlawful interactions between police departments and communities of color in a place like Baltimore. And we generated complaints for Los Angeles and Chicago, and we're seeing similar trends there. So it's safe to say in a lot of places where racist and biased policing is already in place, this technology only really amplifies it. It doesn't really address it or make it any less worse. So the last technology I'll speak to really quickly is social media surveillance. And so to give a quick primer to this, the role of social media for activism can't be understated, or can't be overstated, I should say. And one specific example I'll point to is, as folks have seen here in the United States, under the new administration, there was an attempt to implement a Muslim ban, and we'll call it that because that's actually what the president himself has called it. That's what the surrogates called it. It's a Muslim ban, in effect. And in the aftermath of that Muslim ban being put into place, we saw massive amounts of activism developing and traveling to local airports to protest the implementation of this Muslim ban. A lot of that organizing really happened online and through social media. And there's been articles that have been written that kind of detail the exact kind of etymology of like this activism, and you can track it down to a Facebook post over here of someone saying we need to go out to airports. And you see ways in which social media was used in very innovative ways to ensure that people are actively going out and protesting. So I say that to say that for activists, social media is a very critical tool. What we understand with social media surveillance is that there are companies that have made a market of promoting tools to law enforcement agencies that allow for them to use data that's collected by social media platforms and convert them into tools that police departments can use to actively search through social media platforms. And companies like Media Sonar and Geophedia, what they do is they collect the back-end API data that social media platforms like Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram make available to developers, and they take that data and have converted it into tools that can be used by local police departments. At this point, there are dozens of police departments across the country that have purchased these tools. And the ways that these companies market these tools, because we were able to get some access to their marketing materials, they point to examples like Ferguson and Baltimore in response to uprisings against police violence. they detail how this tool was used by those local police departments to track and surveil local activists. And so they actually speak about political activists as exigent threats. So they apply this layer of criminality to people who are out there saying Black Lives Matter and protesting against police violence. And these tools allow police departments to search by hashtags, to search for specific users, to search for crops of people based on interests. So if you've ever put hashtag Black Lives Matter on your social media platform, a lot of that back-end API data is now available to local police departments. And the data they have access to is a lot deeper than just the Facebook post that we put up. They also have access to geolocation, photos, etc. And so these tools are very powerful. And what we did is we filed a letter with Facebook and Twitter and Instagram in partnership with the American Civil Liberties Union and Color of Change, which is one of the largest online Black civil rights organizations in the U.S.
Stephen, sorry to interrupt. I'll give you a 2-minute warning if that's all right.
Perfect. All right. So we filed a letter with Facebook. We told them, one, you have to cut off contact, or you have to cut off your relationships with these companies. Two, you need to put policies in place that explicitly prevent the use of your users' data for the purpose of surveillance. And lucky to say, this past Monday, they did both. So we had a huge victory in that regard with Facebook and Instagram and with Twitter back in December. So to summarize my points, just to close me out, and apologize for going a little bit over, the application of technology to policing doesn't take away the underlying bias that exists in policing. And in many cases, it makes it worse. And so in this regard, technology is not neutral. And we hear ways in which technologists and people that are adopting these technologies speak to the fact that bias isn't inherent in these technologies, but because technology can't be racist. The other point I'll make is that technology is being adopted at a quicker pace than laws can keep up. So there's a real need for oversight and understanding, like, what are the conditions around surveillance that exist in communities? And in many cases we don't know, because that's by design, where it's being deployed in ways that we can't figure things out. So research in that regard is super critical. And under the current political conditions, especially here in the United States, with the Trump administration, technology will be relied on more to target specific communities. It already is being used in that way. So in terms of thinking about solutions, the points I'll make really quickly is that current approaches to policing cannot be reformed. We believe that, have a really strong belief that technology as a vehicle for reform will not change the underlying bias in policing. All reforms are not equal, that all solutions can be dangerous, and we bring up body-worn cameras as a specific example of that. And here in the United States in particular, who you are and not what you do is a primary determinant of whether you are surveilled in the United States. My colleague at Color of Change, Brandon Collins, likes to say, to be Black in America is to be surveilled. And then leadership must be forged at the site of impact. When at every site, whether it's at organizing, research, the communities most impacted must be at the center of that conversation. That's been the strongest lesson that we've learned in the work that we've done to transform our media system. Our campaigns have been a reflection of that, and I would encourage in your work to really ensure that their leadership is centered in the work that we do. And I'll stop right there.
So our final speaker tonight, Malavika Jayaram, I want to extend our deep thanks for coming and making the trip. It was a long trip from Hong Kong, and we're really grateful to you for coming to spend time with us and speak to us tonight. Malavika is the Executive Director of the Digital Asia Hub in Hong Kong. Previously, she was a fellow at the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society at Harvard University, where she focused on privacy, identity, biometrics, and data ethics. She worked at law firms in India and the UK, and she was voted one of India's leading lawyers. She is adjunct faculty at Northwestern University and a fellow with the Center for Internet and Society India. And she's on the advisory board of the Electronic Privacy Information Center. So please join me in welcoming Malavika. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here. I think it's been about 15 years since I was in Wales, but I see the women still wear very short skirts no matter what the weather is. And they're still singing ABBA at 12 o'clock at night when you arrive, so that's wonderful.
Sorry, can you speak much louder and into the microphone?
Sorry, okay. What, you didn't hear my ABBA jokes? Okay. So I did have slides, but you're not going to get to see them. I have excellent reasons for it, excellent if improbable, for not having shared them earlier. I was stuck in a lift on my way here, but it was a great opportunity to remember the sort of that one person's disaster is another person's joy, because as I was being extracted by 4 firemen, a little kid runs by, looks at his mom and says, "Now can I go and look at the fire engine?" So I was like, okay, if I facilitated that, that's fine. But because I don't have slides, it gives us a great opportunity for all of you to imagine what the internet looks like in a post-net neutrality universe. In a free basics driven walled garden, you can hear my talk, but you can't see the memes, the GIFs, no cat videos, which, you know, it's apparently good enough for poor people, so maybe you can survive for an evening. You know, it's a sort of, you get to experience the whole something better than nothing logic that underpins so much neoliberal technology in the rest of the developing world. So I had my Jodie Foster, you know, panic room moment, so you can get a chance to play act 2. So a couple of things I wanted to start with is just as a framing thing. One is that the Global South is often a beta testing ground for so many emerging technologies, usually wrapped up in some kind of neoliberal spin, not the kind of fun spin that Steven does, no DJs involved. But the idea of leapfrogging is alive and well. The idea that, you know, we didn't need 3G, we went straight from 2 to 4 kind of thing, and that's happening with a lot of technology where we feel, oh, we don't need to sort of go this way, we can just go straight to the next generation, but without the safeguards that the West has. So I just wanted to put that out there, and we have bigger problems, bigger scale, more people, but less science fiction to scare us, so that's not good. But also I just want to sort of caution people in the sort of global north that be really careful about what you do, because we'll copy it. And we'll copy the worst of what you do without the best of your safeguards and constitutional guarantees. So, because one of the things that always strikes me is you talk about poor people, people think about, you know, India or China or other countries. Nobody thinks about poor people in Oakland and Detroit. And I think, why aren't you trying free basics in Detroit? Why is it being visited on us in India, right? There are poor people there too, but there are safeguards. So I think that's something that keeps getting driven home to me. So yesterday I was at an event which was, with Germany being the presidency of the G20 this year, there was an event on consumers and building trust in the digital economy. And this is sort of a list of, you know, my little pet peeves while everybody else was speaking. It was sort of like an access and inclusion 101, or also known as, you know, the 10 obvious things I wish our community never had to say again, which was kind of interesting given these were, you know, sophisticated people who work in this space. But one thing was, I wanted to keep screaming that users are not the problem, right? People keep assuming that, oh, it's, you know, it's dumb users, it's people who don't understand how to switch off the privacy settings, blah, blah, blah. And I kept thinking, you know what? If you frame users as the problem, maybe your technology sucks. Maybe you need to rewrite your code. Maybe you need to change your program. But on the other flip side, they're not the sole solution either. I think to the extent that we keep talking about transparency or giving people agency, that's wonderful on so many levels, but I think to some extent companies and governments are abdicating their own responsibility by pushing responsibility onto the people weakest in the chain, the ones least able to navigate technosocial systems. The third thing I wanted to say was the barriers to access and inclusion don't come from a single source. And therefore the corollary is the solutions aren't going to come from one discipline either. So I think this sort of Morozovian solutionism, Silicon Valley sort of way of looking at things isn't the only way to be. And that when we think of social justice and data justice as well, there is this sort of fetishization of access and connectivity as if we just got all these people online, you know, democracy will miraculously happen. You know, if we could just connect them, never mind the terms of the connection, never mind on what terms they access and use whatever it is that they use, you know, the thing they might be connecting to might be a very censored internet, but it's just this assumption that whatever they're connecting to, connectivity is good. So I want to keep sort of underlining that access isn't an end goal. It's a gateway to many other things. Maybe it's the gateway drug to other human rights, but we need to be mindful of that it's not a solution in itself. And similarly, this idea that inclusion isn't a problem that can be solved and then we can all go home. I think it's an ongoing process because we're going to have to keep including for different things. Society keeps evolving. So this idea of solved and next isn't going to work there. A lot of this underlines my view that there isn't a one-size-fits-all approach, and this kept coming up in today's discussion as well, that asking for whom, why, what for, really basic questions, it really helps. One thing I keep being reminded of in my work is that marginalized users are not fools. They may be unsophisticated, but if you want the best data plan, ask a poor person, because every cent counts. People assume, there's this wonderful idea that poor users are very loyal, and they're not. They'll be sluts about going from one mobile provider to another. They'll have 16 different packages to game the system every way they can. So I think when we view people as being unsophisticated, it doesn't mean they're idiots. And I think on one hand this is true. On the other hand, when we're trying to drive access, inclusion, and other goals of social justice on the back of other programs, whether they're government delivery, benefits, welfare, it's not always to the benefit of the consumer. It's more efficient, but maybe it's more efficient for the company to keep costs down. It's more efficient for government to do surveillance. It's not necessarily for the end user. So I think try asking users what they want and need and how they use technology, and I think we might be surprised. So that was like 10 points, but I think I can give you a little 11 bonus, Brucey bonus, because I think poor people want to watch porn and watch video games as much as anyone else. This idea that they can edit Wikipedia. No, that seriously, they don't want to edit Wikipedia. So this idea that we can give them a walled garden, they'll be fine because as long as they get Wikimedia, life is okay. No, not really. So a few provocations. I think a lot of this has already been said, so maybe I should just go into specifics. But one thing I want to really bring back this point. I think William Gibson said that the future is already here, but it's unevenly distributed. And I think nowhere is that more true when it comes to justice. He was talking about technology and the future and this utopian view of this utopian imagination of the future, but I think when it comes to justice, that's even more true, that we live in a just society it's taken hundreds of years to get here, but that's unevenly distributed. But I think so too are the costs of being connected and the costs of disconnection. They're visited differently on different communities. The ability to opt out, the ability to say privacy is a luxury that I'm willing to pay for, or the ability to sort of say, I don't like this system, I'll stay out of it. I don't think we have that luxury in a lot of the developing world. It usually involves a trade-off for poor and marginalized people. They pay with their data, surprise, surprise, more surveillance, or with constraints like walled gardens, but I think we need to be mindful of that. So some of the tropes I keep hearing in my work is something is better than nothing. It's good enough for the developing world, it's good enough for poor people, or let's try something, they'll be grateful. Or Indians don't care about privacy, Chinese don't care about privacy, it's a cultural thing. But it's free, so what are they complaining about? It's a trade-off, it's a balance. So I keep hearing this, but I think for a lot of communities, they don't realize that if they're free, they're the product. We know this, they don't know that. And information asymmetries and negotiating positions are all about power differentials that can't be overlooked, and some places are worse than others. So what do I see as some of the challenges? One is that users are often seen as the object of projects to solve access, inclusion, and other social goals, not as equal participants. We're trying to solve their problems when they're not in the room. They're not in this room, they're not in most rooms. And access and inclusion don't just begin with seats at the table, but with genuinely being heard. So, of course, there's always the civil society box that gets ticked in every multi-stakeholder process. Now, there's a word I wish we never had to hear again. They're at they have seats at the table, but do they actually have an influence on the outcome? Do their drafts make it into the final version of any policy document that's adopted? Not really. And I think in sort of the centralization of solutions and the sort of scaling everything up to a global level, which is wonderful to shine lights on a lot of these things, I think we neglect that there are certain small grassroots solutions that are bottoms up that work really well, that are context specific, that work for local communities, that are embedded in local practices and are owned by communities, that they have a sense of ownership and belonging that seem natural to them, and some top-down view of what works because somebody will once publish a PhD paper on it and it'll live in a journal article that will be downloaded twice in its life. And there's no feedback loop. They're objects of research, but nobody ever comes back and says, you know what we did with that great research where you were one of the people we interviewed? Here's what we found. And here are the lessons, and would you like to use it in your own community? Maybe you're going to do government differently and disrupt things the right way. So I think that's a challenge. And I think there's also what I sort of see as a trust paradox, where poor users don't trust governments. They're cynical because they've been screwed over by every system known to man. They will game it, they will find cracks, they will subvert it, they will abuse every system known to man. But equally, because they are super trusting about things they don't understand, they do need safeguards to be baked in at the platform and infrastructure level. So in the privacy community, you hear a lot of talk about privacy by design and ethics by design and all of these other wonderful buzzwords. But I don't think we talk enough about trust by design, where even if you wanted to, the system couldn't screw you over. And I think there are certain minimum safeguards and standards that we could build in. So I'm just going to throw out a little quote here and ask if you know where this is from. It's about allowing the trustworthy to roam everywhere under heaven, while making it hard for the discredited to take a single step. Any ideas where that's from? Not The Wire. Not Black Mirror either. Sorry? Gandhi. Love it to be, but no. That's actually from China's social credit system, the new system that they're rolling out, where everyone will have a score, not just based on their own behavior and what they do, which is creepy in itself, but on what everyone else in their network does. So you take a loan, you don't pay it back, guess what? I don't get a loan next time, right? Which is super creepy. It's like surveillance on steroids. And it's sort of it's this idea of a public credit score, and there's a 2014 planning document about this, which talks about how it's an important component of the socialist market economy system, which to me read like an oxymoron, but that's just me. And its inherent requirements are establishing the idea of a sincerity culture. Also, I'm thinking Stasi and databases and census. But it's this idea of carrying forward sincerity and traditional values, where those lovely traditional values where, the village mentality where we report on our neighbors, that lovely value we want to embed. And it will forge a public opinion environment that trust keeping is glorious. I hear glorious, I think Borat, make glorious country of Kazakhstan kind of thing. But this idea that somehow, this new system will reward those who report acts of breach of trust. And I mean, the hubris of this program is just staggering, because it's more than the social and it's more than credit. And to me, that's just insane. There are a lot of red flags with a system like this. Switching colors, it's a black box. But interestingly, algorithms under this system are treated as trade secrets. So God help you trying to find out what they're all about. So it's the same as trying to find out the formula for Coke, but with much more frightening consequences. And these government blacklists, which will surprise nobody, are being shared with private companies, because what they're actually doing it's not one social credit system, it's being piloted across 5 different companies, all of whom are trialing different sort of implementations of this. And they're all sharing their data with the government, and it's this sort of bidirectional breach of trust. But they're closed systems as well, and there's also a lot of research about how the data that is generated internally, sort of in-app, your behavior in-app will be weighted more strongly than behavior outside of that ecosystem, which again is crazy. You have sort of vendor lock-in. There's a complete lack of context in this social credit system. Someone who borrowed their son's Metro card to go through the turnstile because there has enough money on it and it charges them twice is going to be treated the same way as somebody who broke through without a card, right? So there's absolutely no lack of context. And there are 5 dimensions to this: credit history, behavioral habits, the ability to pay off debts, personal information, and social networks. Apart from that, you're fine. And why I found this super interesting is because this is something that keeps getting talked about. I live in Hong Kong, and China's next door, or technically we're part of China. So this keeps coming up, this sort of mega surveillance project, but it's not that different for me from the Indian Biometric Identity Project, which is the world's largest biometric database. And I think they have very similar ideas, because in one of the sort of NPR articles about the Chinese system, it talked about, I think it said, what's your public credit score? The Shanghai government can tell you. And that's very similar to all the posters for the Indian ID project, where they say, who are you? We have the answer. This whole idea of you don't exist unless you're in a database, or if you're not counted, you don't count. You have no benefits, you have no entitlements, you're invisible. But I think in terms of the sort of social justice angle, a couple of things I wanted to say before I wrap up was, there is this sort of very shiny, allegedly technologically neutral system being rolled out, allegedly for people's benefit. But then they found really weird things that they'd never anticipated, which was, and this is from an article by Ursula Rao and Graham Greenleaf in Surveillance and Society, where they're talking about subverting identity from above and below. And there's this wonderful paragraph where they say, as homeless citizens began enrolling, they found their fingers to be wanting, right? So even your body is imperfect in the face of this system. The first effort at encoding a perfect set of 10 fingerprints usually failed. The machines could not identify the unique contours of fingers damaged during a harsh life on the streets. Ironically, the very people that this project is supposed to bring into this sort of inclusive system. Enrollers began a struggle against the dust that had settled into the skin of manual laborers. A wet towel was passed from person to person. Rub your hands strongly, technicians would repeat, at times performing the procedure up to 5 times to produce a sufficiently detailed reading. It improved the success rate, but it couldn't help those who'd lost fingers or fingertips. Polio is still not eradicated, right? We have leprosy, we have all kinds of other problems. They were told to wait for a specially authorized enroller to arrive who could certify their disabled status. Waiting for Godot, This person never showed up. Surprise. Thus, all those bearing the marks of high-risk construction industry in the form of deep scars, severed fingers, or mutilated hands, or those whose biometric data could not otherwise be registered, remained excluded. And I think one of the other really weird conferences I went to, it was the LGBT community in Bangalore, that when this project was rolled out said, oh, now we can register as male, female, or T for transgender. Wow, that's super inclusive for a country like India. But they were not idiots. They were like, wait, does this mean we just get listed somewhere? Do we want to sign up? Do we get benefits, or are they outweighed by the surveillance apparatus? What do we do? So I was asked to go and talk to them about the legal implications of this. And of course, as the only lawyer in the room, in a room full of farmers and villagers, agricultural laborers, prostitutes, a whole bunch of different people from all kinds of gray economies, people were looking at me as the one who had all the answers. And people were asking me super strange things like, oh, so, I inherited 3 pieces of land as the oldest son in a Hindu Brahmin family. So if I now go and register and self-identify as female or as transgender, what happens to my property rights? Do I lose my land? And they're like, where's the clause in the law that provides for this? And you're going, you must be on drugs if you think the government has thought of that, right? Or people were saying, so far I've been able to game every system possible because for me, identity is fluid. I don't have to be fixated in a system as, anywhere. It's a spectrum, right? But gender and identity they're not binary things. So I can sort of show different faces depending on different contexts, based on religion, based on communities, based on who I'm talking to. So now do I get fixed in the system and frozen forever and ever? I can never negotiate my identity in ways that get me benefits and entitlements. Where does the law stand on that? And you're like, nope. Or I'm going through a sex change operation. I've got hormonal replacement therapy going on. My fingers are growing bigger. What happens? Will it sort of screw with the database? Will I keep getting pinged as a false positive or a false negative? How is that going to work? There have been tests and trials on this, right? And you're like, nope, I don't think so. So I just wanted to sort of highlight some of these. I was talking in very abstract terms earlier. I wanted to just sort of bring it back to very specific ways in which even projects that are allegedly benevolent and can be benevolent and, if well implemented, come up with all kinds of weird things that policymakers just have not thought about. And in embedding and encoding these sort of ideas and in moving them out into the real world without testing them, are we moving from some kind of panoptic sort to some kind of panoptic sort of? Might work, might not, who knows? I had a great big shruggy on this slide, which you don't see, but you know what shruggy looks like. So some of the patterns I keep coming up against is sort of technologies of surveillance plus social problems equals welfare industrial complex, almost instantly. And in a lot of the regions that I work in, people keep talking about privacy and security, and it's a really, really hard struggle for people like me, because someone in the room will say, I don't have food, I don't have clothing, I don't have shelter, I don't have education. You think privacy or security figure on my sort of Maslow's hierarchy of human rights? There isn't one, I just made that up. But TLDR, most things trump privacy or human rights. Security theater is alive and well. I mean, we've seen that with TSA, with everything else in the world. It's much worse in the developing world. Shoshana Magnet has written about this, about how even when biometrics fail, they succeed because people think they're working. Another pattern is sort of if you even critique any of these projects, you're the Luddite, you're anti-progress, you don't like transparency, you're pro-corruption, you want the embedded system to be perpetuated, you're anti-national, somewhere you're not being patriotic if you come out here to Cardiff or Harvard or Oxford or anywhere and talk about the problems of India. Somehow you're sort of letting the side down. And it's really hard, which doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. And the other, I think one of the last points I wanted to make was that in a law and policy vacuum, you can amplify the negative externalities of a lot of these welfare projects. So my last slide was actually, or a couple of last slides, was how many people follow Research Mark Wahlberg on Twitter? What?
Oh, I know.
Research Mark Wahlberg, like Marky Mark from the Funky Bunch? Yeah? No? The most anger management deprived fireman ever in cinema history. So there's this wonderful Twitter account that popped up, which was all about data and all the good things and bad things and all the awful things people do with data. But it's literally like little gifs of Mark Wahlberg saying things like, not cool, bro, clean your data. Or then he was like, big data is the new neuro. I know, right? So there are all these like wonderful like memes that are all about the awful things we do with data and regression testing and all kinds of things. So I would urge you strongly to follow Research Mark Wahlberg on Twitter about all the things wrong with sort of the data fetishization we see in the world. So to end, I just wanted to say that in a lot of the world, we're still in that sort of early 2000s idea of data is the new oil, data is the new gold, data is currency, data is blah, blah, blah ad nauseum. But what if we visualize these metaphors differently? What if we talked of data as toxic? What if we talked about it as asbestos that needs to be removed from buildings very quickly before people die? The idea of data as radioactive or digital kryptonite. There are different ways you can frame it to show how things like data minimization are really powerful and should be done, because data has a half-life. Data is not infinitely valuable. At some point it stops representing the data subjects that it's supposed to and renders them into objects. So in conclusion, I just want to say we could do all of these cool things, or we could just do more to make the idea of data justice ubiquitous, banal, and completely unremarkable. So congratulations to all the people who set up the Data Justice Lab. I wish you didn't have to exist, but I'm so happy you do. Thank you.
So we have close to 15 minutes for questions. Can I invite Virginia and Malavika to come up and join me on the stage? All right, any questions, comments, thoughts?
Thanks very much for a really interesting collection of talks. Unfortunately, I've forgotten the name of the project, but I heard my friend from Denmark told me about how there's now like all of your interactions with the government have to go through like a particular app, you have to get. And you have, like, I think his name was something like My Inbox or something that was really hard to search for because I haven't been able to find it. And he was describing how his grandmother had to fill in a form to say that she didn't know how to use computers good enough. And this would only last for 2 years, and she had to fill in the form again in 2 years' time to sort of opt out of this system. And like all of the benefits, interactions, and I suppose I was wondering when I think you mentioned something or other about the sort of how the future's here already, and there's justice in some places. And I wondered if that was anything that you folks knew anything about.
Can we take more because I don't have to remember the whole
It's a question about data neutrality and bias in computer processes. When you have a human designing or devising a algorithm, you can control the kind of bias to a certain extent that goes into it. On the other hand, on machine learning, when the computer learns it on its own from data input into it, then it's much harder to control. And my specific example is about face recognition. If you input data, faces of white people, you will, or black people only, you will to a large extent determine what the computer does with it. And I'm thinking in terms of policing, for example. If you input a large data set of black faces, the computer will tend to, the algorithm will tend to find black faces more combine them more easily than white faces. So the question is about this: how do you audit or control for this kind of bias?
Should we do one more?
It was mentioned that initially the introduction of the body-worn cameras was supposedly to monitor policemen so that they would not get up to misbehaviour, as it were. So is there any way that regulations could be rushed out, in the absence of course banning such cameras, so that they are only forward, that they are only facing towards the policeman and never towards the public, as a means of it not being misused in the way that they're being misused? And secondly, with regard to the collection, shall we put it, of all these texts and messages, etc., of cellular phones, is there nothing in the US Constitution which actually outlaws this? I would have thought it would do. And if not, do you think there's not the need for very fast legislative new laws to ensure that there is no interference and collection of such without at all, but failing that, without it being expressly given permission by a very, very high up judge, be it in the USA or UK? I would say that these should be outlawed anyway, but at the very least have some safeguards put in.
All right, thanks very much. Should we just...
Stephen, do you want to take that last question first?
Yeah, I can probably speak to the facial recognition piece a bit and the police accountability piece as it relates to body-worn cameras a bit as well. I think what I'll say is that moving towards reforms and changes in policies is such a slow process in the United States, and I imagine in other parts of the world as well. I think that the technology, like I said, is being adopted at a much quicker pace than the laws can keep up. So some of this is that there is just no case law that actually sets precedents for the limits to what can be done with certain technologies. In terms of facing the cameras towards the police, it's an interesting thing. At the same time as we're seeing the adoption of these body-worn cameras across the country, we're also seeing erosions to the First Amendment here in the United States, freedom of speech, and really kind of limiting the rights that people have to film police officers in the practice of their duty. So you're seeing some judges that are saying, well, maybe the freedom of expression and freedom and the right to record a police officer is not expressly protected under the First Amendment. So that's what I would say is like it's our best defense for police accountability, and it has been for many years. Going back, like having been raised here in Los Angeles, going back to the Rodney King beating in Los Angeles, where a video camera caught what many people in Black and brown communities knew to be true in Los Angeles, which is that police overstep their bounds when it comes to communities of color here in the city, and they do it in very forceful ways. You had video for the first time, like really revealing this to be true, and and there are cop watch programs all over the country from grassroots organizations that is their express purpose, is to be an eye of accountability with the police. So I think what we would say is that in the hands of police departments, in the hands of the police and in the hands of government, there will always be a function by which this, whatever tool is implemented, if it's in the hands of those entities, it will convert itself into a tool for their arsenal, not necessarily a tool for the community. And I think that the strongest defense we have is ensuring the rights of people in communities to record police officers in their interactions with the community. But like I said, there's been erosions to that. On the face recognition piece, what I'll point to is there's been very little studies actually being done. And companies are selling these products to federal agencies here in the US and law enforcement agencies across the country. And they tout their own personal numbers. The companies themselves will say, well, like our software is 99% accurate based on very little evidence of any testing. The only real research that's been done on face recognition technology, now there's been a report that recently came out from the Center on Privacy and Technology at Georgetown Law in Washington, DC, that kind of looks at the full scope of face recognition technology in the US. But the only real study that's been done on how accurate these technologies are was done back in 2000 and a couple years ago, maybe 2014, something like that. And it found that there was inherent bias in and not just bias, but that it was inaccurate in coming to determine the accuracy, or in coming to find to identify someone positively in an accurate way when it came to communities of color. In particular for Black women, that was even worse. So the only research that's been done by this, and one of the people that was involved in that research was an FBI expert who worked on face recognition technology, and admittedly in the report admits that there's issues with it being able to identify communities of color in more accurate ways than those of whites. And I think to the point that you were making, if you train the data with a data set that is primarily white, that is what it can do well. So certainly if you happen to be a white male and they run a search on face recognition technology, there's a higher likelihood that they'll identify you positively and accurately than if you were a person of color. I mean, I think the way that you get to it is in places where it's being used, there has to be independent auditing. Like you have to test, you have to audit and ensure that it's actually accurate, and have those audits not be paid for by the companies themselves that are selling these products to local law enforcement agencies. So I think that's one solution that I would highlight as a way to get there.
So I want to respond to, I don't know the Denmark system particularly, but one of the things I think that's interesting about that is challenge like compulsory systems. And they can be compulsory by law because it's a national system, or they can be compulsory because you don't have access to your basic human needs, right? And then it becomes compulsory to be in those systems. But I think compulsory systems are very interesting because they challenge our immediate go-tos in privacy, which is like inform and then choose, right? And like it doesn't. So that's one of the things that's quite interesting about those compulsory systems. But I want to speak briefly to this algorithmic decision-making question that was raised, and the unique sort of challenges of machine learning, just by using the example of the system, the child maltreatment predictive system in Pittsburgh, because I think you're correct. But I also think this idea that we can program algorithms to be biased is is a little shaky, right? And so I'll give you the example of the Pittsburgh case. It's not a machine learning algorithm. It's just actually a statistical model. It's pretty old school. Like they sort of promote it as like being the smartest robot ever, but it's just like a regression. One of the things that's interesting about it is like the thing they're most concerned about, the harm they're most concerned about is the death or near death of a child, right? Which is, there's really good reasons to be concerned about that. Fortunately, for the world, that doesn't actually happen very often. Unfortunately, for the system, that doesn't really happen very often, right? So they can't actually use that as an outcome variable of their model, right? So they have to choose a proxy. The proxy that, one of the two proxies they chose in the Pittsburgh system was re-referral to the hotline, right? So if you get called on once, caseworkers decide not to open a case, decide to close the case, and then you get called on a second time within 2 years, then that becomes their stand-in for harm is actually happening to a child or is likely to be happening to a child. The problem with that, and there's actually a study done in Allegheny County just like 3 years before they built the system, is that the point of the greatest bias of the child protective system is not actually in caseworker decision making, and it's not actually in call center decision making. The greatest bias comes in through the calls themselves. People call on Black families at grossly disproportionate rates. And that's not just community members like calling into hotlines, but also mandated reporters. So an emergency room doctor will see a spiral fracture in a white kid and will be like, oh, did he fall off the monkey bars? We'll see a spiral fracture in a Black kid and we'll be like, you're abusing your child. And so they've actually built an outcome variable that, that overlooks the fact that they've chosen to say abuse is the actual point at which the most discrimination enters the system. And the problem then becomes the sort of intensification of that process, the potential intensification of that process. So even when it's not machine learning and it's not being tested on sort of legacy bias target training data, like that kind of bias can still enter those systems. But the larger question you're raising, I think, is a really good one and a discussion that we could maybe have together, which is like, what's the solution, right? That's, I very much hear you saying that.
Hello. First of all, I just wanted to thank all three of the speakers for great talks, but also for bringing such passionate engagement to a subject that can be really abstract and depersonalized, and also depersonalizing. It was really invigorating to hear all three of you speak about issues that are affecting people now, but are also repeating patterns that have been impacting those same types of groups of people for many generations, and consolidating, in fact, systems of power that have been in operation for generations, going back hundreds of years. The question I had, really, if it's even possible to answer, is two-pronged, really. I mean, it's how, obviously, it's a situation where you're always fighting, always trying to draw attention to things that are slipping through the gaps. How can we make sure that these situations continue to be visible, and given that they are consolidating power systems that have been in place for a long time, how realistic is it that we can, that sounds a bit pessimistic, how realistic is it that we can overcome them? And even within an academic framework, which in many ways tends to be quite elitist in itself, how can we start to tackle these issues?
I think one of the examples that I can give you is that when there was a lot of corruption in India with a lot of government procurement, like we didn't know, how money was changing hands, how big public systems were being built, the right to information became a very new right that was enshrined in a law, and people were using it. So it was sort of like FOIA legislation in the US, where citizens could ask for information from their governments. Over time, as it was a very powerful tool, but over time, as the government got more used to people asking for information, they adapted the law so that the exceptions became bigger and bigger. So people got access to less and less data. That was sort of on the governance side. But in a practical sense, what was happening is the really weird, unintended, and cruel consequence was people who made these requests were getting injured, were even getting killed in certain circumstances. Journalists were getting killed for making these requests. But then what people did, little communities who were filing these requests changed the ways that they filed them so that they decentralized it so it didn't go in the name of any one person. So they actually had a system where you didn't even know. So there'd be 8 people writing up your application. You didn't know who the other 7 were that you were collaborating with. So they found ways to sort of solve for the problem that was happening and build an anonymity into that system. So I think every time the sort of law or any kind of entrenched system pushes back and resists what you're trying to do, there are ways that you can be resilient and adapt. And it's an arms race, but some days you feel you're winning, some days you feel like you're desperately losing and you're the only one who cares, which is why it's nice to come to places like this.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Okay. Well, thanks very much, everyone. So we will hopefully see you all downstairs for wine. Thank you to our speakers again. Thanks very much.